Mishary Alafasy, the world famous Quran reciter, is once more causing controversy. He has released a new nasheed. And guess who this new nasheed is directed at?
نور الفجر ما بعد بان قبل الصلاة والليل حالك ظلامة تبت ايدي نيران واللي معي ران حنا اهل التوحيد رمز الشهامة تبت ايدي نيران واللي معي ران حنا اهل التوحيد رمز الشهامة اهل التوحيد.
Tabbat idan Iran wal ma' Iran. May the hands of Iran perish and those that support Iran. Not very subtle, especially with the background imagery, the soldiers, military aircraft. But I have to say, mashallah, he has a nice voice and it's a catchy tune. Now what also really caught my ear, he says, نحن أهل التوحيد. We are the people of Tawheed. We are the people of monotheism. When he says that we are the people of Tawheed, of course he's directly referring to the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia. Of course, for anybody with half a brain would find this statement really odd. You are the people of Tawheed? With all the treachery, with everything that's been exposed, with your alliances, with you sitting idly by as Gaza has been destroyed and annihilated, you still refer yourselves as the people of Tawheed? You still hold yourselves in such high regard? And this kind of rhetoric doesn't only come from the leaders and the so-called sheikhs and the influencers. But when you interact with the everyday people from the Gulf, they all hold the same sentiments. They still hold their leaders in their countries in such high regard. They are the flag bearers of Islam. They are the defenders of Islam. It's like they are completely oblivious to everything that's happening. They're oblivious to the secularization and liberalization of these very Gulf countries. And it's a very strange thing. Like, how could the average person, we understand the rulers, we understand their mouthpieces, but the average people, why haven't they moved on like the rest of the Ummah? Why hasn't there been an awakening like there has been in the rest of the Ummah? When you look to the Muslim world, you find that almost throughout the whole Muslim world, when the Arab Spring occurred, it almost touched every single country in the Muslim world. And nearly all these countries, to the average person, they understand the hypocrisy of their leaders. They understand the treachery of their leaders. They understand the oppression of their leaders. And you find the majority don't support their leaders or don't defend their leaders the way the Gulf people defend their leaders. So what exactly is going on? How come we've seen such a awakening in the rest of the Muslim world, where they now finally they are aware of what their leaders are doing, their treachery, their oppression, the actions that are completely against Islam? They almost have nothing to do with Islam and the Muslims. Yet in the Gulf countries, we've seen very little of this. When the Arab Spring occurred and it engulfed nearly all the Muslim world, we saw hardly any resistance or protest occurring in these Gulf countries. So why do they still hold these views of themselves? Why do they still hold themselves in such high regard? Why does the average person in the Gulf still have this view towards their leaders? To understand this correctly, we have to refer back to history. We have to go all the way back and look at the beginnings of Saudi Arabia. This modern nation state that we see with these borders of Saudi Arabia, okay, is really a modern invention. Historically, if you go back in the history of Islam, there was no such thing as Saudi Arabia. In fact, most of these countries did not exist all throughout the Muslim world. So what exactly happened? Well, you have to go back to 1744, the beginnings of this Saudi state. The family that rules Saudi Arabia today, Al Saud, at that time, they made a pact with a scholar named Muhammad Abdul Wahhab. And the pact was that Al Saud would be the ruling class, the political class, and Muhammad Abdul Wahhab and his offspring, his family, his lineage, they would be the religious class. They would be the clergy. They would look after the religious matters. They would dictate what should be taught, what should be practiced inside Saudi Arabia in terms of the religious aspect. So it's this union in 1744 with the beginnings of this modern Saudi state that we see today, okay? It's this union really that made Saudi Arabia and in fact all of these Gulf countries what they are today. Now of course we know that eventually this whole Gulf region, the Arabs, when the seed of nationalism was planted in their hearts by the British and they were armed and funded and directed by the British, they revolted against the Uthmani Khilafah. Right? And of course, when the Uthmani Khilafah fell in 1924, then all right, a lot of these states were born and their borders were born. Now, what made them unique, as I said, was you had this alliance between the political class and the religious class. Right? So the religious class were basically there as a garb to cover up for the treachery of the rulers, the corruption and the oppression of the rulers. Okay, you garble with Islam, you make it seem legitimate. Because of course in Islam, who do the Muslims look up to? Who were we instructed to look up to by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and by Allah? The ulama, Ahl al-Dhikr. We hold them in high regard. We look to them for their opinions. We look to them to follow in our religious issues and in our political affairs. So now when you have a whole religious institution, its main job is to protect this ruling class and direct people to obey them, all right? And then you twist the verses and the hadith to convince people that these are the true rulers. This is ulil amr. These are the people of Tawheed. Right? You owe your allegiance to them and you have to be loyal to them and you cannot rebel against them. So that's what made these Gulf countries unique. Right? Whilst the rest of the Muslim world, when the Uthmani Khilafah fell in 1924, and even before that, right, again, with the British and the French really colonizing the Muslim world, they spread the seeds of nationalism and secularism and liberalism all throughout the Muslim world. And this is indeed what happened. Right? Most of these Muslim countries, they became extremely secular. If you look back, for example, at Egypt, right, the most populous Muslim country, I saw this video once, I think it was a TikTok, where they compared the streets of Cairo back in the 40s and the 50s, and they compared them to today. Right? If you looked at Cairo back in those days, you'd think it's a modern, European country, modern European city. There was barely any women wearing hijab on the street. Right? The men were all in suits, they were clean shaven. The women were in skirts. Okay, it looked just like any other European city. Whereas compared to the fast forward today and look at Cairo, it's the complete opposite. The men are in beads, the women are all in hijab, okay? But that's just to paint you a picture of what the Muslim world looked like in the 1800s and 1900s. It was mostly completely secularized. For example, in Syria, we know before the fall of, before Ahmed al-Shara took over, you had Bashar and the father leading Syria, and Syria was a Ba'athi state, it was a socialist state. It had nothing to do with religion. And the country was indeed secularized. In fact, the secret services would watch people, all right, who's actually frequenting the mosque. All right? People would actually be scared to frequent the mosques. You'd be punished for regularly frequenting the mosque, or if you have a long beard. So that was the state really of the whole Muslim world up until the last 30, 40, 50 years, when alhamdulillah there was a massive awakening. The Muslim world was basically all secular. Now that secularization that occurred in these countries, this doesn't really happen in the Gulf countries. And the reason the secularization didn't occur in these Gulf countries the same way it did to the average people throughout the rest of the Muslim world was it because of this alliance between Al Saud and the family of Abdul Wahhab. Right? So these societies remained very insular. Right? You had aspects of the hudud, the punishment system still being implemented. You had the schools, the curriculum all controlled by the religious clergy. In the Gulf countries, you had, for example, we know the famous Lijna, the group that, the police, the shurta that, they called Lijnat al-Amr. They were responsible for commanding the good and forbidding the evil. Right? And they would go around in the streets. If you didn't have a beard, you were punished. If the women were wearing hijab, they were punished. Right? So these societies remained very insular. Right? All that secularization, liberalization, the religious class in these countries protected the Muslims in that region from that. And because of that, because these people remained insular, the average person had this view, yes, internally, right? And it's true, internally, a lot of aspects of Islam were being implemented. The way people dressed, right? The role of the woman, the role of the man, okay? What's prohibited, riba, okay? Some of the punishment system, this was all being implemented, all right? So if you're growing up in these countries, in your eyes, your scholars are telling you these are the people, this is the ruler, and you see that the ruler internally, a lot of Islam is being implemented and you're protected from secularization and liberalization, then yes, you're going to grow up believing, okay, these are righteous people. This is the land of Tawheed. We're separate, we're unique compared to the rest of the Muslim world. So of course, internally this was occurring, right? They remained very traditional, very classical, very insular. But of course, when it came to the politics externally, what the royal family was doing, what the ruling class was doing, none of that had to do with Islam. Their foreign policy, their allegiances, okay, their corruption, taking the wealth of the ummah, all of that had nothing to do with Islam. But because the religious class was there to shield the population from seeing all of this. So people grew up believing that yes, these are the lands of Tawheed, this is pure. Our leaders are righteous. So in the 1990s, when the Gulf War occurred, America attacked Iraq, America and its allies. How exactly did they attack Iraq? Well, these Gulf countries allowed them to set up bases, Western bases, military bases in the Muslim world. Why didn't the Gulf countries, why didn't their populations react? Well, again, the clergy was there. They were there ready to give out the fatwas. They gave out the fatwas that this is necessary. These are Ahlul Kitab, we can make alliances with them because we need to fight the Kafir Ba'athi regime of Iraq. Now really it was this fatwa that was the final straw. Up until then, the religious class, they were able to cover up for their rulers no matter what they did, and they were able to justify it. But with this fatwa allowing Western bases, American bases in the Muslim world to attack and unalive Muslims, this was too much. This was unjustifiable. This is not something now you could cover up anymore. People started to notice what exactly is going on. Who are our rulers? And why is this religious class covering up for them? And this caused a massive schism in what we know today as the Salafi school of thought. But that's a much deeper topic. I don't want to digress too much. But I have another video discussing that, and I'll link it in the description if you're interested in that. But from that time onwards, from the 90s onwards, there was a lot more resistance, there was a lot more opposition, there was a lot more awakening as to the actual reality of these rulers in the Gulf countries. Of course, another aspect to this is the economic aspect. Because most of these Gulf countries, they're rich in energy resources, and their populations are not as large as the other countries in the Muslim world. So a lot of the Gulf countries, the average person, he lived a standard of life, right, that the average person in the other Muslim lands, such as Syria or Egypt, for example, they didn't live that standard of life. Right? And so when we know that when people are not in poverty, they're willing to overlook a lot more. Right? As long as they're happy, as long as they can own a home, as long as they can feed themselves and feed their family, okay, they won't be as agitated, they won't be as angry. So they're easier to rule, easier to manipulate. Now, in spite of what happened in the 90s and the fatwa that was given and the opposition to it, and how, a lot of scholars and even the average people started to realize there is something wrong here. By and large, these countries, for the average person, they were still insulated. They still didn't experience, they didn't see what the rest of the Muslim world was seeing. And so this is where we are today. This is why, these Gulf countries still view themselves in this way. Because the scholars, the so-called scholars, as we see in the nasheed by Mishary Alafasy, they still propagate this propaganda. We are the people of TAWHEED. We are fighting Iran, The Shia, the Rafida, the deviants with the corrupted creed. And the average people still buy a lot of this propaganda. In spite of the recent, efforts we see to open up the Gulf countries, to allow secularization and liberalization on a scale that these Gulf countries have never experienced before, the average person still views their leaders, holds their leaders in high regard. They still defend their lands as the land of Tawheed. Now let me be very clear. I'm not a defender of Iran. I'm not making this video in support of Iran. I've made my thoughts very clear about Iran, the Iranian regime, not the Shia as a whole. I consider the Shia Muslim. I don't want to see the Shia being bombed. I don't want to see their women and children being bombed and unalived. That's not good for the region. But the Iranian regime itself, like all of these regimes throughout the Muslim world, it's committed horrific crimes against the Muslims. And we have the clear examples of Iraq and Syria. Of course, this is a much bigger topic. It requires a lot more nuance, and I've gone in depth into this topic in a few other videos. I hope you liked this video. I hope you found it beneficial. If you found it beneficial, please share this material. Please leave a like, please leave a comment. And please help support the channel by subscribing.